So the topic is, the title that I've titled this is Why Marry? A biblical vision as to why the unmarried should marry. And it's coming from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9. I'm going to read the section, the chapters verses 1 to 8, so we have it, or 1 to 9, so we have it in context. But we're going to specifically zoom in on verse 9. I'm going to talk about the context that Paul was writing to in the Corinthian church, but then I'm going to contrast that context with the context in which we live today. And then we're going to spend a lot of time dissecting and potentially deconstructing the culture in which we live and what they're teaching unmarried people. And then we're going to turn to what the biblical vision for unmarried people is. And we're going to see the stark contrast and the stark difference. And we're going to talk about why it's so vitally important that the Christian and biblical message get out into culture. So let's begin by just reading 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And some of this, the verses we go through won't exactly apply to what we're talking about, but just so we understand the context of where verse 9 is coming from. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote. And so, first off, we see that the Corinthian church has written to Paul a letter. We don't have that letter. We don't know exactly what they wrote, but we have parts and pieces of it. We'll come back to that in a moment. To which you wrote, "It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive each one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as myself," which Paul is single, "but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." And we are going to zoom in on this section here, verse 9. "But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." And I don't know why I always pick the most difficult topics to preach on. Last time, money. Now this time, marriage and sexual passion. So the early church context was this. They had this sense that Jesus was going to return at any moment. And it was urgent that the gospel be spread across the entire world, so that they could have the opportunity to repent of their sins, be forgiven, have eternal life before Christ returns. So there was a sense of urgency about this. And Paul was teaching about this urgency, but some were taking it a little too far. And they were starting to think, well, maybe we shouldn't marry at all. And maybe if we are married, we should essentially give up on that. And maybe we should consider all sexual relations bad. And we should just devote ourselves entirely to the Lord. So they were asking these questions. Should a Christian remain single in order to do God's work? Should a Christian who is married leave the marriage to do the Lord's work? And are sexual relations sinful in today's context, given what we know about Christ leaving and now coming back? These were the three essential questions they were asking Paul. We can deduce that from the little bit we have of their letter and how Paul responded to their letter. So Paul's response is summarized with this. it's good to marry. It's good to remain single if one is single and doing the Lord's work. If one is married, they should remain married. Sexual relations are not bad in themselves, but sexual relations are confined to married relationships. If someone who is unmarried burns with passion, it's better to marry than remain unmarried and continue burning with passion. And so those were Paul's response. So, today we have a much different context, though. Today, we're not dealing with a church in the Western culture that's eager and excited to do the Lord's work and spread the gospel and willing to forsake marriage and forsake sexual relations and forsake any potential marriage on the horizon. No, we have a much different culture today. But where we do have a similar culture is that people are delaying marriage. They're prolonging their adolescence, and marriage is being delayed. The average age of marriage currently is 31 for males and 29 for women, which is and I see your face, because when you were growing up, it was nowhere near that. This is... As soon as you're ready, off you go. No. So it's the latest it's ever been in world history is what we're at now. Just think about that. There's never been a time in world history where people have gotten married on average at the age that they're getting married now. It's the latest it's ever been. So what's that mean? Well, on the same hand, on the same token, we are teaching as a church, and Paul's teaching, withhold from all sexual relations until you're married. That marriage is the only place for proper sexual relations with someone else. So essentially what we're doing now as a church is we're asking children, youth, to wait 17 to 20 years before they embark on a journey that their body has been calling them to embark on for many, many years now. Which is, in turn, becoming unrealistic, because over 85% of people enter marriage having not waited for marriage before they got into sexual relations. So we have prolonged adolescence, delayed marriage, high rate of sexual immorality happening in the culture and even in the church in the West right now. So what do we do about this? What is the church's call to this problem we have? How do we respond? And why are people prolonging marriage? What's going on here? Why are they waiting so long? And that's what we're going to look at today. Why are people prolonging adolescence? And this is the part where we begin to try to observe, analyze, and deconstruct the current culture we live. There's many, many reasons why people are delaying their marriage, and we're going to try to sort it through here. One of the reasons is, and I borrow this term from Jordan Peterson, we're living in the Peter Pan fantasy. And so if anyone's watched Peter Pan, it's the story of kids who travel to Neverland where they can be kids forever. You never age. You just remain a kid forever. What we're experiencing is many kids, many youth becoming adults, but they're still actually kids, adult-like kids. Why is that the case? We're going to get into that, but that seems to be what's happening. People just want to remain kids forever, and parents are, whether directly or indirectly, encouraging them to live like kids forever, because perhaps they want to nurture their kids, and they want to protect their kids from all the terrible and bad things that could happen in the world. So they continue to shelter and shelter and shelter more and more and more. This is exasperated by the very problem of prolong and delayed marriage, because if you have a society that has delayed marriage and then they finally get married and they have kids, they have fewer kids. And so currently the birth rate in our society is under the number for replacement birth rate. So we're having not enough kids to replace the population that's dying. We've heard of overpopulation, but what's the trend is showing is that it's going to be an underpopulation. The birth rate's not keeping up with replacing the population. So when a older couple has a child, they're more likely to have less children. When you have less children, you take less risk with your child because that's all you have. And if you lose that one child, you've lost the rest of your generations and lineage. Opposed to a family that may have 5 children, they take a few more risks with those children. So we have the forever nurturing mother, so to speak. And of course, that's not the case for everyone, but it's the temptation when you only have one child left. We also have a decline in rites of passages. And so in traditional societies, it was really evident when a youth went from a youth to adult. They had these rites of passages. With the elimination of these rites of passages and the diversification of how rites of passage should look across the nation in the Western Hemisphere, it's very unclear as to when a child actually becomes an adult. And so with the decline of rites of passages, we have this sort of never-ending, fuzzy kind of when do they become an adult sort of ideal happening. We have also the absent fathers. And the role of a father when a youth begins to grow into adulthood is to be the one who steps in and kindly and gently pushes the child into the real world and says, so to speak, spread your wings and fly. The mother traditionally is the one who wants to nurture and protect. The father's role is to protect the kids from the mother. Go. With absent fathers present, it becomes harder and harder for the youth to define when they become adults. Number 2, we have an inadequate school system. So another reason for prolonged adolescence is the lack of emphasis in our education system on financial independence. And so a large part of what gives a male a confidence to want to embark on marriage is that they feel confident and assured of themselves that they can be financially independent and be able to provide for their wife and the offspring that she may produce for him. But if they don't have that level of confidence, that level of knowledge, that level of understanding of what it takes to be financially independent, to enter the marketplace, to be able to produce and do well, that they are left feeling vulnerable. And therefore, whether consciously or not, they are left feeling like they are not ready for marriage. Thus, adolescence gets prolonged all the more. We're simply not teaching financial literacy to young people currently. Even when I went to school, I can only remember a couple courses on the subject, and that's only gotten worse over time. And so now what we have is this teaching to males. Okay, you go to high school, but when you're done high school, go to college, do your 4-year degree. By the time they get out of their 4-year degree, they're now 23 or 25 years old. And they still, more than likely, depending on the degree they chose, still have no financial knowledge and confidence in order to embark on being financially independent and being able to provide for someone else. And they have a lot of school debt behind them. So you have this 23, 25-year-old male with no skill in the marketplace, racked with student debt, living with their parents still. And now we understand another reason why marriage is being delayed. They're simply feeling completely unconfident on the situation. Number 3, poor government policies. So on one hand, we have this crisis happening with the males, and they're feeling not literate financially, racked with student debt, including the females, and now they're crying out to the government, help us, we need help. And the government now steps in as the forever nurturing mother and starts to provide the handouts that they're asking for in order to buy the votes that they want to keep themselves in power. But what that does now is it increases taxes across the nation, because money doesn't grow on trees, or does it? And it goes out and the taxes go up. The businesses now have more taxes to pay, so they put the prices of things up. So the very people complaining for the handouts are still not being helped because the cost of living now is high for them. So now racked with student debt, racked with no skill to make money, expensive groceries, expensive gas, they are still unable to find a way to become financially independent, therefore breeding the confidence they need to go find a spouse that they desire to have. And believe me, they desire to have. The other problem that the government will do to exasperate it is put red tape on builders. And if anyone would know about red tape on building, it would be this local church who has been trying desperately to build a new church building for way too long. With the inability to build houses quickly enough to keep up with the population, and with the increase of immigration coming in, making the housing situation on a greater shortage than it ever needed to be, we now have the cost of housing rising. So now you don't know how to work in the marketplace. You have student debt, and you can't even afford to purchase a house where you feel you could bring a family into and provide for. And we wonder why marriage is delaying. And I'm going to spend time painting a very dark picture here, but there will be hope at the end, I hope. I hope. And so now let's turn to the fourth one, a negative vision on marriage and kids. We spent some time looking at the males. Now let's turn to look at the females. So on top of the financial pressure put on males in the ill-equipped education that they're receiving and how they can give contribution to the marketplace, they also have a class of women who are their prospective mates who are being fed a vision that marriage is not great. It's actually slightly oppressive. And having kids is only going to detract from your future career and aspirations. So even if the young men were able to overcome the financial hurdles that they had, now their prospective spouses are a little weary of them in terms of a serious committed relationship because of the message being given to them. Marriage is a ball and chain. Kids, they're just going to distract you. Wait. Continue waiting. But for how long? Well, this waiting doesn't come without a cost, because it's fine and it sounds wise. Wait for the right time. Get your goals in order. Get your purposes in order. Wait. But while they're waiting, they are burning with passion. And they're not just burning with passion with great Christian moral purity. They're burning with passion, and they're going out and exercising the passion in which they burn. This is evidence in the stats. And now, with the birth control and abortion industry growing, women can now go and burn with passion without the risk of having a child out of wedlock. And there's no talk or teaching on the consequences of these actions. For example, They think, oh, I'm doing fine. I'm avoiding having a child through birth control. But then there comes a time when they want a child. And the birth control had the negative effect of making them unable to have a child. But they're not given these warning signs going forward. It's just wait, avoid, avoid, avoid. And we also see that while they're waiting and the hookup culture is happening and the dating scene's happening, because they're not waiting with purity, we see a lot of broken relationships happening, broken hearts starting to occur. And so while it's great that women have had the opportunity to rise in their careers, and on average, statistically, they are actually succeeding their male counterparts in the current academic situation. And there's reports of them rising in their careers quicker. But we see this trend happening, and it's most clearly seen in the field of law. The women are rising to the top of their ranks in law. They get to age 30 and they realize, I feel my biological clock ticking, and I'd like to have a child. And so they finally do end up having a child. And then they realize, I really like having a child. I don't even want to go to work anymore. And then they actually remove themselves from work. But for some, it's too late. So we have this whole problem occurring. And while it's occurring, and while these relationships are taking part, hearts are breaking. Bad relationships are forming. And what they're going to start to do now is, okay, we've been told, just wait, don't get married yet. But we're going to sleep together. We're going to live together. We're going to live as if we are married, but we're not actually married. And they think that's smart, they think that's wise, but it begins to prove otherwise. It begins to prove that actually those who live together before marriage are more likely to divorce once they get married. So the whole idea of test driving your marriage, so to speak, it just simply doesn't work. The test drive fallacy does not work. So we have hurt men, hurt women, now building a mistrust with one another, and marriages being prolonged. So the other fears that we may have, and say you did decide to avoid some of these pitfalls. Maybe you're able to be wise and figure out how to be financially independent. Maybe you're able to avoid some of the hurts and pains caused by living outside of God's will for your life. Now there's this fear that can creep in, a fear that's been propagated through some of the older generation who have experienced divorce. Do not choose the wrong person. Be careful who you choose. And they begin to wonder, well, who should I choose? Who do I marry? And there's a fear, I don't want to choose the wrong person. Added on top of that, they have many, many choices. Back in the day, you had about 4 choices. Whoever lived in the community, who was around your age, who was still single, those were your choices. Now you have about 1 million or 2 or 20,000 million choices. You could go online, you can search countless profiles from people all across the world. With all these choices, people become overwhelmed and inundated with too much information. And they end up becoming paralyzed, paralysis of, I don't know, they say it in board games all the time. Someone say it again? Analysis paralysis, thank you. And they are unable to even make a decision anymore. So we can just see how these young people are being bombarded with so much. They don't think they're ready. They're afraid to choose the wrong person. All meanwhile, they're waiting while burning with passion. So then the pornography addictions begin to develop. And we see that rampant in young people, which furthers them being distant from marriage, because now the anxiety steps in. The anxiety to talk to the opposite sex steps in, and they become more isolated and more isolated within themselves. It's all about how they feel their feelings and meeting their desire through a screen, and now even through robots. So we're getting more and more removed and isolated from marriage. So someone comes along and says, well, we need to be concerned about marriage. We need to care about marriage. But they have all these misconceptions on what marriage is. Well, why do I need to marry? It's just a piece of paper. We've heard of this. They're ignorant of the importance of symbolic action, the power of public testimony, and the importance of vows before God and the community. I already know I love her. Why do I need a piece of paper to prove it? And so marriage gets delayed all the more. Or they're just waiting for the perfect spouse at the perfect time for the perfect wedding. But what happens is the perfect partner never comes around. The perfect time never does seem to arrive. And the perfect wedding always seems to have some kind of failure. No matter how much you plan, the chef cooks the chicken a little too long, something always goes wrong. So we have this unrealistic setup for our young people. We've over-fantasized marriage on one hand. We've devalued marriage on the other hand. We've told them to wait forever, essentially, on the other hand. And we're hoping that they would stay pure until then. What are we doing here? We're setting them up for a complete disaster, and that's exactly what we're experiencing now, is complete disaster. So, the task then, that is why they're prolonging. The second question was, what should the Christian church do about this? The task then of Christian parents and church leadership is to help equip young people, unmarried people, to prepare themselves for marriage by helping them know who are good partners for them, helping them understanding what a covenant of marriage is and why it's important, helping them understand the power of sex and the reason why it's confined to the relationship of marriage, teaching them how to be providers, teaching them how to balance career and education and family life in today's culture. And so that is the task that the church has. So, what are some good reasons why a person would marry? Well, God simply says right in the beginning in His word, in the Bible, it is not good for man to be alone. There's a certain sense where we actually do better when we're in a pair, when we're in a couple, when we're joined. It's very difficult being alone. So the desire is there. When we talk about burning with desire, we're not talking merely about physical attributes. We're talking about the desire to become one with another person. They're craving, and we need to explain to them that the desire is the craving to be actually married, to not just have some kind of physical experience, but to become one with another person, to be completely in tune with another person, a team with another person, going together, chasing what God has for them together. See, we don't need to give up our dreams and our aspirations just for the sake of marriage. But when we come together in marriage, together we can have a dream together, aspirations together, careers together, kids together, and we can do this whole thing together. Yes, we might be in a financial pickle, so to speak, in today's culture, but together with Christian principles, we, and I speak as if I'm a young couple, can come together and fight through those financial difficulties together. That actually, when men get married, they tend to become more focused and more determined on what it is they need to do. They actually have less distraction in their mind and body going on. So the very thing that's being taught that's a distraction, which is marriage, is actually the opposite. It's actually the thing that brings two people together and helps satisfy the desires that they have within themselves, become one with another, so that they can actually chase what God's placed on their heart together as a unit. And yes, it may not be ideal, and there might not be the perfect situations. We have to get creative. I knew one couple married, very few couples married during college. Everyone's single. But this couple was married, and they just did so much better in school even. They did it together. They fought their low income together, and they built a life together quickly. They were a great example of that at a young age. So we can consider these things if you're burning with desire, because it's better to marry than to burn with desire. And in terms of who we choose, God made woman for men, and she was perfect. So whatever person you have is the perfect person. That's how God made it. That's the perfect mate. They are a woman, and you are a man. And that's perfectly how God designed it to be. Yes, there could be some different personality types that need to be considered. People have different dreams and aspirations, and those need to be considered. But all in all, if the person believes Christ is Lord, and you guys both agree on that, this is what the marriage is founded upon, that Christ is Lord, that we believe in God, and we believe He has a mission for us. And we can sort the rest out, because personality changes. Likes and dislikes change, but God never changes. So that's the foundation upon which marriage needs to be built. So yes, we approach it with wisdom, but we need to begin to approach it with wisdom earlier on. We need to begin to consider these things earlier on. If we think it's just going to happen naturally, it's not. We're set up in a culture which is designed for it to not happen naturally. It's going to either never happen or happen because they get to age 30 and they realize, I better do something about this or I'll be single forever. We need to be proactive in our faith about how we go about approaching marriage and counteracting the struggles that culture throws on us. We need to set up our own culture that defeats the culture before us. And hopefully the culture we set up as a church is so compelling, and it will draw people to the church to want to be part of that, because we're setting up what it looks like to be healthy, to have healthy families. Without marriage, we don't have healthy families. Without healthy families, we don't have a healthy nation. We need a healthy marriages set up in order for there to be any change in culture, any change in the nation, any change in the Western Hemisphere. When we talk about culture wars and battling back and doing what's right, one of the number one ways in which we can battle back is setting young unmarried people up with the wisdom and knowledge that they need to have a healthy marriage. Healthy marriages will defeat much of what Satan has planned for the culture. We see it happening, and we see it happening all the more. So in the words of St. Paul, it is better to marry than burn with passion. So I remember being a young man reading this verse for the first time. I took about a week to ponder it, whether I had the gift of singleness or not. And, well, it didn't take long. And I realized, no, I think I'm going to need to marry. And I set out to want to marry, and I had none of this knowledge at that time. I knew none of what I talk about now. And I fell into pitfall after pitfall after pitfall, trying to figure out how this thing works. It got so bad that I was sitting there about age 28, age 29, and working on a PhD, and I shaped my whole PhD around the question, how does a Christian find a spouse in today's culture? I was baffled. I was mind blown about all the problems I would have trying to find a spouse. And I was trying to do it the right way as a Christian, but landing into all these problems. Thankfully, I did find Elena. But I also was age 30. I was at that average age. So I don't speak of this as a place of, I figured it all out. I speak of this as a place of, I had to take a look at my own life, the own culture I lived in, and realize, wow, something is completely awry here. I happened to be able to wait until marriage, but it wasn't without other consequences. And it wasn't exactly the healthy way to do it. I felt a lot of unhealth within me as a single man prolonging my marriage, but I wasn't also prolonging my marriage on purpose. I realized I was not really necessarily the best candidate either, because I had a ton of student debt. I hadn't figured out this whole thing. But thankfully, the Lord placed on my lovely wife's heart to marry him anyways. Sometimes that's what it takes in today's culture. Coming together as a team, and that's what we were able to do and accomplish to get to where we are today. So I put all these thoughts out there as something to think about. And I recognize that my current audience today listening to this may mostly be married. But the thoughts are still there, and the message is still there. And it's a message we can take to those we know who may need to hear it. And hopefully the recording worked, and we'll be able to get that out to some more people. But I do think it's a message that more unmarried and parents of unmarried people need to hear. So thanks for your time, and I'm going to end in prayer. I said we'd open it to Q&A, so I better do that. But let's just pray. Thank you, Lord, for this time here as we enter into some Q&A. In your name we pray. Amen.